Evelyn Rourke's suitcase was sitting in the rain before her son arrived. Director Conrad Whitmore declared she could no longer afford her care, though the records showed every bill had been paid. When single father Gavin Rourke demanded his mother be returned to her room, the security guard blocked him at the front entrance. Conrad smiled and told a man who smelled of sawdust and drove a rusted pickup that a carpenter had no business telling him how to run a senior residence. Then the trust's attorney walked in, looked at the small plaque on the lobby wall, and asked, "You don't know who paid to build this place, do you? If you believe a son's devotion cannot be bought or buried, stay for the secret behind this door." Havenridge Senior Residence stood at the edge of Briar Glen, Pennsylvania, the kind of building that looked calm from the outside. Brick facade, manicured hedges, a wide front drive lined with solar-powered lanterns. From the road, it appeared exactly as it had been designed to appear. Dignified, stable, a place where age was not a shame but a season. What the road did not show was what had been slowly carved out of it over the past 2 years, room by room, resident by resident, until the building's original purpose had been hollowed like old timber left in the rain. What the road did not show was that on a gray Tuesday morning in October, a 74-year-old retired librarian named Evelyn Rourke had been given less than 60 minutes to pack her belongings and leave. Her walker had been placed beside the fire door. Her medications, a small orange bottle of blood pressure pills, and a foil sleeve of anti-inflammatories left over from her hip surgery, were still locked inside her room. And her suitcase, a worn tan carry-on she had owned since the 1990s, sat on the concrete beneath the front awning while a cold rain moved in from the north. Gavin Rourke received the call at 7:43 in the morning, while he was running a bead of wood glue along a cabinet frame in his workshop on the south side of Briar Glen. His mother's voice was careful and quiet in the way it always became when she was trying not to worry him. She said that it had been a misunderstanding at Havenridge, that they were asking her to step outside while some paperwork was sorted, that she was sure it would all be resolved in a few minutes. Gavin put down the glue, wiped his hands on his jeans, and was in his truck before she finished her second sentence. He had learned to read the pauses in his mother's voice, the way a carpenter reads grain in a piece of wood. Not what was said, but where the silence went taut. He drove the 11 minutes to Havenridge without turning on the radio, and when he pulled into the front lot and saw the suitcase on the wet pavement, and his mother sitting in a folding chair near the entrance in her housecoat, one hand resting on her walker, he understood that no paperwork was being sorted. Conrad Whitmore met him in the lobby with the polished composure of a man who considered himself unreachable. He was 52, broad-shouldered, with the habit of clasping his hands behind his back when he spoke, as though the gesture gave his words official weight. He informed Gavin without preamble that Evelyn Rourke had accrued 3 months of unpaid care fees, that she had repeatedly refused to follow her prescribed treatment plan, that she had been documented creating conflict among other residents, and that on 2 separate occasions she had accessed areas of the facility outside her authorized zone. Conrad listed each item the way a man reads a bill of sale, evenly, without inflection, without looking directly at the person across from him. Gavin listened in full, then asked calmly to see the written termination notice. Conrad produced it, a single sheet printed that morning, signed in blue ink. The effective date listed on the document was 3 days prior. Gavin pointed to the date. Conrad explained that administrative processing sometimes lagged behind operational decisions, and that the system recorded the termination when the review was completed. Gavin looked at Conrad the way a man looks at a structure he already knows is unsound. Not with surprise, but with the particular stillness of someone measuring exactly how much damage is going to happen before anything can be repaired. He then asked if he could retrieve his mother's medication from her room. A security guard stepped forward before Conrad could answer and positioned himself between Gavin and the hallway. Conrad said that accessing a former resident's room without escort was not permitted under Havenridge policy. He looked at Gavin's sawdust-dusted jacket, at the calluses on his knuckles, at the rusted F-150 visible through the glass entrance, and something relaxed in his posture, a visible calculation that reduced the man in front of him to a category he considered manageable. Evelyn had been brought inside by then, sitting in a chair near the reception desk, her back straight in the way it always was, as though her spine had long ago decided that slouching was a form of surrender. She watched the exchange between her son and Conrad with the patience of a woman who had spent 30 years in a school library waiting for students to arrive at the right answer on their own. When Gavin asked her quietly whether the bill charges were real, she handed him a folder. Inside were printed bank confirmations, each one dated within the payment window Conrad had described as missed. She had been keeping them for 2 months, ever since a friend named Arthur Bennett mentioned that he had been charged $9,000 for therapy sessions he had never attended. Her voice dropped when she added that this was not about money. She had seen something, she said, that Conrad needed no one to see. When Gavin turned back toward the desk and said he would not be leaving until his mother had her medications and a written explanation of the legal basis for the eviction, Conrad smiled thinly and said that Gavin could take whatever concerns he had to the Kingsley Senior Care Regional Office during business hours. He turned to a staff member and said something in a low voice. A moment later, the inner doors buzzed locked. Conrad looked at Gavin through the glass and said that Evelyn Rourke was no longer the responsibility of Havenridge. Gavin stood at the locked door without raising his voice. He said simply that Conrad might want to look into whose responsibility Havenridge actually was. The woman who walked through the front entrance 12 minutes later looked like someone who had parked 2 blocks away and walked in a straight line, which was exactly what she had done. Mara Ellison was 45 years old, wore a charcoal overcoat, and carried a slim briefcase, and had the particular expression of a person who had learned to keep her reactions internal and her questions external. She was the attorney for the Lena Grace Community Trust, and she had driven to Havenridge that morning for a routine annual compliance review, the kind that had been written into the original funding agreement 8 years ago, and that no director of the facility had ever taken seriously enough to prepare for. She saw Gavin and Evelyn near the reception area. She saw the suitcase. She saw the locked inner door. She set her briefcase down on the counter and asked Conrad Whitmore what the nature of the situation was. Conrad explained, again with his clasped hands and his measured tone, that a former resident was being processed out and that a family member had become disruptive. Mara asked for the name of the resident. Conrad said Evelyn Rourke. The expression on Mara's face did not change, but something in her stillness sharpened. She opened her briefcase, withdrew a bound document with a blue cover, the original funding agreement between the Lena Grace Community Trust and Havenridge Senior Residence, and set it on the counter with the quiet weight of someone placing a loaded deck on a table. She told Conrad that she needed to clarify something before the situation continued. She turned to Gavin and said, for the benefit of everyone in the room, that she wanted to confirm whether he wished to invoke his rights under Article 7 of the Founding Covenant. Conrad looked at the document, then at Mara, and asked what exactly she meant by Founding Covenant. Mara set one finger on the cover page and told him that the Lena Grace Community Trust, which held primary donor status at Havenridge Senior Residence, had been funded entirely by one individual. She looked at Gavin. She said his name clearly, Gavin Rourke. She said that the $22 million used to construct, equip, and endow the operating reserve of Havenridge Senior Residence had been provided by Gavin through this trust, and that the trust's name, Lena Grace, was taken from his late wife, a hospice care nurse who had died of a brain aneurysm 7 years prior. She pointed to the small bronze plaque mounted near the water fountain. Lena Grace Community Trust, founded in love, sustained in service. The plaque had been on the wall for 8 years. No one at Haven Ridge had ever thought to ask who Lena Grace was. The lobby went quiet in a way lobbies rarely do. Not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of everyone present recalculating something at the same time. Conrad's composure did not break so much as realign. He began to speak about the misunderstanding, about how deeply he valued the trust's relationship with the facility, about how Evelyn's situation would of course be reviewed immediately, and she would be given the finest available suite. Gavin said no. He said it without hesitation or anger, just the flat certainty of a man who had already decided. He said his mother would be returned to her original room and treated exactly as any other resident paid to be treated, with no upgrades, no special arrangements, and no preferential status that would not have been extended to someone without a son who had funded the building. He said he had not paid $22 million to get his mother a better room. He had paid it so that every room was worth something. Evelyn was escorted back to her room with her medications retrieved and her folder of billing records in her hand. When Conrad attempted one more apology, she looked at him and said that he was not sorry for having put an old woman out in the rain. He was sorry because the old woman's son turned out to be the person he was afraid of. Mara stayed behind to conduct her review and informed Conrad, with professional precision, that the eviction of Evelyn Rourke constituted a violation of the Resident Protection Clause under the founding covenant, and that this violation triggered the Trust's right to an independent audit of all financial and care records for the prior 24 months. Gavin walked back to his mother's room, helped her settle her medication on the nightstand, and noticed that the shelf above her small desk was missing something. A green folder she had shown him once, the one with the names of residents who had left Havenridge in the past 3 months, was gone. News of what had happened reached the Kingsley Senior Care corporate office within the hour. Madeline Kingsley was 38 years old, the CEO of an organization her father had built into one of the largest senior living operators in the Mid-Atlantic region, and she had spent the past 4 years trying to convince the industry that she had earned her position through work rather than inheritance. She arrived at Havenridge that afternoon with 2 members of her legal team and the composed demeanor of someone who had walked into rooms containing bad information before and knew how to move through them without letting the information move her first. She had reviewed the summary Conrad had sent during the drive, the Trust's audit request, the eviction dispute, the identity of the donor. She had also reviewed the Havenridge performance reports for the past 18 months. The numbers had always been excellent. Conrad gave her a fuller picture in private. Evelyn Rourke, he said, had been intervening in other residents' care decisions, removing physical documents from the nursing station and creating an atmosphere of suspicion among staff. Gavin was not a philanthropist acting in good faith. He was leveraging an old donation to gain operational control over an asset that was no longer his to direct. The billing discrepancies were being reviewed, and the termination notice had followed proper procedure, even if the timing appeared irregular. Madeline listened, asked 3 clarifying questions, and then went to find Gavin. She told him she understood this was a deeply personal situation. She offered to waive all remaining fees for Evelyn's stay and transfer her to the premium care wing at no cost. Gavin said that the problem was not whether his mother would be taken care of. The problem was what happened to a resident who did not have a son with $22 million behind him. The 2 of them stood in the hallway outside the activity room for a moment that stretched longer than either of them expected. Madeline was not accustomed to being answered that way. Not with anger, not with accusation, just with a question that pointed directly at the thing she hadn't asked herself. She said that Gavin was responding from emotion and that the appropriate venue for these concerns was a formal review process. Gavin said that his late wife had worked in a care facility that billed patients for services they never received and discharged them when their coverage ran out, and that Lena had come home from work for 3 years describing what that looked like from the inside, and that the reason Havenridge existed was to be the thing Lena had never found a version of. He said that a company built to care for people had no more serious obligation than to prove it meant that. Madeline did not respond immediately. Evelyn had been listening from inside the activity room and came to the doorway. She told Madeline about Arthur Bennett, a retired electrician in his mid-80s, one of the sharper minds on the floor, who had been charged $9,000 for a cognitive rehabilitation program he had never been enrolled in. When Arthur questioned the charge, he was told the system had logged his participation automatically. 3 weeks later, his family was contacted and told he required a higher level of care than Havenridge could provide. 2 days after that, Arthur's room had been converted into a premium suite. Evelyn had spoken to 7 other families with similar accounts. That was what had been in the green folder. Gavin formally invoked Article 7 and requested an independent audit within 72 hours. Madeline said she would authorize it and asked that he not speak to journalists before the process was complete. As they parted ways in the corridor, a folded note was pressed into Gavin's hand by a nurse he had not been introduced to. He opened it outside the stairwell. It read, "Do not trust the electronic records. They have been changed." The audit team arrived the following morning. Gavin, Mara, and a financial analyst Madeline had brought in began pulling records, resident files, billing logs, care plans, discharge paperwork. The digital system showed 31 residents had voluntarily left Havenridge over the past 6 months. The category codes were consistent: voluntary transfer, financial transition, care level upgrade required, family requested relocation. But the paper logs in the nursing station told a different sequence of events, and the staff who had been present for many of the departures remembered them differently than the records described. Gavin spent 3 hours making phone calls. One daughter in Ohio said no one had ever contacted her before her father was transferred to a facility more than 200 miles away. A son in Maryland said he had been told the move was mandatory due to a licensing issue that, when he later checked, had never existed. A woman in her late 80s had been billed for memory care assessments on dates when her own handwritten journal, which her family had kept, showed her attending a reading group in the activity room. Madeline reviewed the performance reports Conrad had submitted to the corporate office over the same period. The occupancy rates for premium suites had increased by 38%. The cost per resident for what the reports called standard care had dropped by nearly a quarter. Both numbers had earned Conrad commendations in the quarterly executive summary. She had sent him a congratulatory email in June. She found it in her own records and read it again in the hallway outside the conference room. And the words felt like they belonged to a version of herself who had not yet understood what she was looking at. Julian Vossas at the end of the hall and walked toward them with the steady pace of a man who intended to slow something down. He said that discrepancies of this kind were an expected artifact of the facility's digital migration, that the audit should be narrowed in scope to avoid alarming staff and disrupting resident care, and that Havenridge was currently being positioned as the flagship for a $600 million regional expansion, and that nothing about this moment required the response it was getting. Gavin told Madeline quietly that the man who had just spoken to her was either a very poor manager or a very interested one, and asked which she thought was more likely. He also told her, while they were standing near the window at the end of the hall, about the system he had designed when he built Haven Ridge. The fire suppression infrastructure, the electrical routing, the framing specifications that allowed every wall to be opened without compromising the structure. He told her that Lena had gone through her last surgery in a facility where the equipment was outdated and the staff was stretched past any reasonable limit, and that she had never once complained because she believed the people caring for her were doing their best with what they had. He had built Haven Ridge because she had deserved something better, and because there had been no version of it anywhere nearby, and because money was a thing he had and she had been the thing worth spending it on. Madeline was quiet for a moment. Then Tessa Monroe, the nurse who had passed him the note, found them near the stairwell exit and told them that Arthur Bennett was not at the facility listed in his transfer paperwork. She had called twice. Neither call had been returned. The audit deepened. Mara pulled the trust's financial statements and found that the Care Reserve Fund, originally capitalized at $8.4 million, had been drawn down to under $900,000 over a period of 22 months. The withdrawals were documented under a series of capital improvement categories: fire suppression system upgrade, construction of the West Rehabilitation Wing, purchase of therapeutic equipment, management consulting fees, resident relocation logistics. Gavin reviewed the line items one by one and said nothing for a long time. He had designed the fire suppression system himself. The system had been completed before the building opened and had not required modification since. He pulled the original engineering drawings from Mara's files and compared them against the invoices for the upgrade. $6.4 million had been paid to a construction firm for work that had never happened in any building he had designed. He traced the payment records through 3 shell companies, a process that took most of the afternoon and required Mara's access to registered business filings in 3 states. The first company's registered agent was listed as a man who shared a last name with Julian Voss's brother-in-law. The second had a post office box at a mail center in Wilmington, Delaware. The third had an officer listed who also appeared on the board of a property management firm with ties to Conrad Whitmore. The shape of what had happened was becoming visible in the way that structural damage becomes visible when you pull back the drywall. Not a crack, but a pattern, running all the way through. Madeline sat with the document spread across the conference room table and said out loud that she had given Conrad the highest performance rating in the region 3 years running, and that she had never once asked him what the profit margin on a senior care facility should actually look like if it was being run correctly. Gavin said that realizing a mistake had value only if she was willing to fix it, even when fixing it cost her something. It was late in the evening when a document appeared in Mara's email from an account she didn't recognize. A forwarded message, formatted to look like an internal communication, in which Gavin appeared to demand $500,000 from Madeline in exchange for his silence about the audit findings. The email bore a timestamp from 2 days earlier. Within the hour, a wire transfer of exactly $500,000 appeared in the Lena Grace Community Trust's operating account, originating from a business entity registered under Julian Voss's second corporate address. By the following morning, the email had reached a reporter at the Briar Glen Tribune. The story that ran online described a shadowy donor using his elderly mother as leverage to extract payment from a senior care corporation, a man who had hidden his identity for years and was now emerging to make a claim that looked, on its surface, like extortion. Gavin's name, which had never appeared in any public record connected to Haven Ridge, was now on the internet alongside words like benefactor and blackmail. A television truck parked outside his workshop. 2 clients called to cancel contracts they had signed the previous month. He stood at his workbench and looked at a half-finished armchair he had been building for a widower on the north end of town, and did not touch it for several hours. Lila called from her dormitory at 1 in the afternoon. She was 19, a first-year architecture student, and her voice carried the particular tension of someone who had just read something about a parent and did not know what to do with the information. She asked if she needed to come home. Gavin said no. He told her to keep going to studio, to finish the model she had described to him last weekend, to not let someone else's decision to be dishonest alter the trajectory she had built. She said she loved him. He said the same. After he hung up, he did not call anyone else. The Kingsley Senior Care Board sent a formal request to Madeline that afternoon. Suspend the audit, revoke Gavin's access credentials, issue a public statement clarifying that the trust's involvement was under legal review. Sterling Kingsley called his daughter directly and said that protecting a man who was now under public suspicion while the company's stock offering sat in review was not a defensible position. Madeline met with Gavin in the Havenridge parking lot, because by then neither of them had access to the interior. She told him the board had raised questions about the wire transfer and the email, and that she needed to hear his account of both. Gavin looked at her steadily and asked if she was asking because she actually believed he had done it, or because she needed to be seen asking. She did not answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. He took his access card from his jacket pocket and set it on the hood of her car. He said that he had built Havenridge because he believed that old people should not have to prove they deserved kindness. He had not anticipated a day when he would have to prove the same thing about himself. He drove his mother home and did not return that evening. Mara spent the next 2 hours with metadata. The email had been sent from a device registered to the Havenridge network, from a terminal in the records room. The same room where Gavin had spent the majority of that afternoon reviewing paper files in a space that, as confirmed by the facility's own access logs, had no external internet connection and no wireless capability. The device had been placed there by someone with administrative access to the building's IT infrastructure. Tessa, working from her own laptop in her car in the employee parking lot, traced the authorization credentials used to initiate the $500,000 wire transfer. The account belonged to Julian Voss. Evelyn heard what had happened from Tessa, and she walked down the hall to the room where Madeline was still sitting with the documents, and she said only, "The man who just left refused to put his name on this building because he did not want a generous act to become an advertisement." She asked whether Madeline genuinely believed a man who had hidden a $22 million gift for 8 years had then tried to collect $500,000 in exchange for silence. Madeline drove to Gavin's workshop the next morning without calling first. She arrived alone, no lawyer, no assistant, no prepared remarks. She found him building an armchair with a high armrest and padded grip handles, the kind that made it easier for someone with limited mobility to stand without assistance. He had built versions of this chair for several residents at Havenridge over the years, always without charge. She watched him sand the curve of the armrest for a moment before she spoke. She did not tell him the board had pressured her. She did not explain the institutional dynamics that had made her hesitate. She said she had asked him to prove his honesty while her own system went unexamined, and that was a failure of judgment she could not justify with circumstances. Gavin kept sanding for a moment. Then he set the chair down and told her that an apology could not return the residents who had been moved, could not give back the weeks they had spent away from their families, could not undo the fear they had felt when someone in a professional office told them their home was no longer their home. Madeline set a folder on his workbench. It contained transaction records showing the wire transfer's origin, Julian's access credentials, and the network log from the records room. She told him she had suspended Julian's financial access and flagged both him and Conrad for immediate investigation. She told him she was prepared to publish the full audit results, halt all resident transfers during the investigation period, begin the process of reimbursing families who had been billed for services never rendered, and ensure that Tessa and every staff member who had cooperated with the audit received formal protection from retaliation. She said she understood if none of that was enough. She said she would accept the board's decision to remove her if it came to that. Gavin asked her what she wanted in return for all of that, and she said she wanted to know if the audit had found Arthur Bennett. He said not yet. But they were close. He said he would return to Havenridge on one condition, that the board meeting addressing the findings be held in the common room, in full view of current residents and their families, and not in a conference room on the executive floor. He said the people most affected by what had happened deserved to be present when it was addressed. Tessa called them both within the hour. She explained that the original Havenridge data infrastructure had included an automatic backup protocol that wrote copies of all care records to a secondary server embedded in the nurse call system, a server Conrad and Julian had overlooked when they migrated to the new platform. She said the backup was still there, and that she believed it contained the unaltered versions of every record that had been modified over the past 2 years. Then Mara called from her office and told them both that she had just received notification of a pending sale. Havenridge Senior Residence, under a motion filed by Conrad Whitmore and approved by Julian Voss in his capacity as regional CFO, was to be transferred to a development partnership within 12 hours. The entity listed as the buyer was Whitmore Development Partners, registered under the name of a property attorney with no known public affiliation to Conrad. Gavin recognized the name from 2 of the shell company invoices. It had appeared in the contractor section, buried in the second page of a materials billing statement from 11 months prior. The transaction had been structured to look like an emergency asset liquidation prompted by insolvency. The insolvency itself manufactured through the same cycle of fraudulent invoices and withdrawn reserve funds that had been running for nearly 2 years. The plan, as Gavin reconstructed it in Mara's office, was not complicated in its ambition. Empty the building by removing the residents, drain the trust fund through ghost contracts, declare the facility insolvent, sell the land to yourself through a proxy entity, and convert a senior care residence funded by a $22 million charitable gift into a luxury development at a fraction of its actual market value. Gavin used the original building drawings to locate the nurse call system's secondary server, a panel behind a locked access door in the utility corridor on the ground floor, the same corridor he had walked through during construction, when he was still the person making decisions about what went inside the walls. Tessa met him there with a portable drive and the password from a laminated card she had found, taped inside a maintenance manual on her first day on the job, left by the IT contractor who had installed the system and apparently never removed. The backup server contained what she had believed it would contain: the unaltered medication records, the original care assessments, the genuine discharge notes, and, most significantly, the internal message logs from the administrative system, including Conrad's directives to create behavioral incident reports for residents who had challenged billing charges, and Julian's approval signatures on every fraudulent contract payment that had left the trust's account over the previous 22 months. Arthur Bennett's actual transfer record showed he had been transported not to the licensed rehabilitation center named in his official file, but to a low-cost convalescent motel 40 miles from his daughter's house, with no care coordination, no family notification, and a forged signature on the discharge consent form. Madeline sent a car for him that evening. Mara found the document she had been searching for in the original covenant files. The Havenridge Community Covenant, a 2-page rider attached to the founding agreement, which stipulated that the property could not be transferred, sold, or rezoned without written consent from the Lena Grace Community Trust. Julian had removed this rider from every copy of the covenant distributed to the Kingsley Senior Care Board. The original, notarized version had been in Mara's locked filing cabinet for 8 years because Gavin had asked her to keep it there. The board meeting began 40 minutes earlier than scheduled because Conrad had moved the start time in an attempt to complete the sale signature before Madeline could invoke her authority as CEO to relocate the proceedings. Madeline arrived at the front entrance of Havenridge with Gavin, Evelyn, Tessa, Mara, and Arthur Bennett, who had been returned the night before and who was sitting in a wheelchair with the collected patience of a man who had been waiting a long time to be in the right room. Conrad had locked the board conference room from the inside. Madeline used her CEO credentials to open the common room and announced to the staff on duty that the meeting of the board of directors was being relocated pursuant to her authority under the company's governance charter, and that any board member who wished to participate should come to where the residents were. Most of them came. Conrad appeared in the doorway of the conference room and said that financial matters of this sensitivity should not be conducted in front of an emotionally vulnerable audience. Gavin asked him 4 questions without preamble. Why 31 residents had been documented as voluntary departures when their families had not consented. Why $6.4 million had been paid to a construction firm for work that the original building drawings showed had never been performed. Why the company purchasing Havenridge was registered to a name that appeared in multiple fraudulent invoices generated from within the facility, and why every medication record flagged for audit review had been altered following a resident complaint. He did not raise his voice. He did not invoke his name or his contribution. He asked the questions the way a man asks questions when he already has the answers and is giving someone a final opportunity to tell the truth before the documents do it instead. Tessa presented the server backup. Mara presented the founding covenant and the covenant rider. Arthur told the board in plain terms that he had been placed in a motel without his daughter's knowledge and had spent 11 days believing his family had agreed to the arrangement. A woman in the back of the room, the adult daughter of another relocated resident, began to cry without making a sound. Madeline stood before the full board and said that she had built the performance metrics that rewarded Conrad's bers without examining how the numbers were produced, and that the responsibility for creating a system that made this fraud possible rested partly with her. She said she understood that some members of the board would prefer that this information be managed internally for stock price reasons. She said it would not be. Sterling Kingsley, attending by phone at the edge of the room, told her that she was about to cost the company a $600 million expansion over what amounted to the mismanagement of a single regional facility. Madeline said that a company that made its money from caring for people could not be rescued by hiding the people it had harmed. The board voted to suspend Conrad Whitmore and Julian Voss pending criminal investigation, to refer the financial records to state and federal regulators, and to halt the Havenridge sale pending review of the covenant documents. Mara formally notified Conrad that Gavin Rourke held veto authority over any transfer of the property, a detail Conrad had never known because the document containing it had been withheld from every copy of the founding agreement he had ever received. Evelyn looked at Conrad from across the room and said that her son had paid to build every wall in this building. But Conrad had turned those walls into a kind of prison. Today, she said, they were simply opening the doors again. The sale of Havenridge was voided. Families who had been billed for non-existent services received full reimbursements with interest. Residents who had been transferred without family consent were offered assistance returning to Briar Glen or relocating closer to their families. Arthur Bennett moved back into his original room and his daughter visited him every Sunday. Conrad Whitmore and Julian Voss faced investigation on charges involving financial fraud, falsification of care records, misappropriation of charitable funds, obstruction of an audit process, and systematic violation of resident rights. Tessa Monroe was appointed Director of Resident Care for the facility, with authority over all staffing decisions related to direct care and full access to the audit committee. The Kingsley Senior Care Board authorized a full restructuring of the company's performance evaluation model. Occupancy-based profit incentives were eliminated. A resident advisory council was established at each facility. Employee whistleblower protections were formalized in writing. All care fees became publicly listed documents, and no resident transfer could be processed without independent confirmation from either family or a state-appointed advocate. Sterling Kingsley called his daughter 3 days after the board vote and told her that she had cost the company more money in 1 week than any single executive in its history. Madeline said that the cost of maintaining something that did not deserve to survive was higher than the cost of changing it. She did not say anything else on the subject, and he did not press her. Gavin declined a board seat, a management advisory role, and the title of founding director. He agreed to serve as the honorary chair of the Community Oversight Council under the condition that every decision made by the council required at least 1 current resident and 1 direct care staff member to be present and heard. He returned to his workshop and finished the armchair he had been building. He delivered it, without charge, to the widower on the north end of town who had ordered it, and who had been following the news coverage without knowing the name of the man who delivered furniture to his door. Madeline began visiting Havenridge without appointments, arriving on ordinary Tuesday mornings, sitting in the common room, learning the names of residents who had no interest in discussing business. Between her and Gavin, something took shape gradually and without announcement, a mutual regard grounded in the kind of honesty that can only develop between people who have watched each other behave well under pressure. Gavin told her that trust was not restored by a press release. It was restored by the way a person ran the days that followed. Madeline said she understood. He believed her enough to keep the conversation going. A year after the board meeting, Havenridge opened a rehabilitation garden that had been planned in the original design and never completed. The wheelchair-accessible pathway through the garden was designed by Lila Rourke as the primary project of her first-year architecture practicum. A set of gentle grades, non-slip pavers, and rest nodes with built-in seating that allowed anyone using a mobility aid to move through the garden without assistance. Gavin walked the path with her on the morning she presented it for review and did not say much, which was how she knew he was proud. Evelyn returned to her original room, continued paying her fees with her retirement income, and took over the management of the small lending library in the common room, which grew from 43 books to over 300 in 8 months. She refused every offer of an upgraded accommodation and every reduction in her monthly contribution. She said she intended to be an ordinary resident for as long as she was able, because an ordinary resident was what she had always been, and she saw no reason to change on account of whose son she had. On the day of the garden dedication, the Oversight Council proposed installing a bronze portrait of Gavin near the entrance walkway. He declined. He asked that a small marker be placed at the beginning of Lila's pathway instead. The marker read, "This place belongs to the people who have lived, worked, and cared for one another here." Evelyn asked her son, as they stood at the garden's edge, watching residents move through the space Lila had built, why he still refused to let anyone know he had paid for all of it. Gavin watched a woman in a wide-brimmed hat being pushed along the pathway by a man who was laughing at something she had said. He watched an aide carry 2 cups of tea from the common room to a table near the fountain, where an older couple sat, without speaking, in the comfortable silence of people who had been together long enough that silence was not absence. He said, "If a place only treats people well because it knows who their son is, then the wrong thing was built." The story came full circle on an ordinary morning in early November, when a new resident arrived at the front entrance with a single carry-on suitcase and the careful expression of someone uncertain of their welcome. The staff member at the desk looked up, said her name before she had finished introducing herself, and asked if she would like to see the garden before she chose her room. No one asked about her insurance. No one mentioned her ability to pay. The door opened and she walked through it, and that was exactly what the place had been built for.